Hello. In this video we're going to look at two things. The first thing we're going to look at is a function that we can use to perform validation. Validation being an important part of programming. And the second thing we're going to look at here is this trace table. And a trace table is particularly useful in this sort of situation, so you can follow the logic and how your thing is behaving. So I'm going to step you through basically how this function works. I didn't want to build it with you, but the function starts and I pass in an argument, and that's going to be the question that they're going to ask the user. Then we begin, and this boolean is going to be set to false. This boolean is valid, is the name of the variable. Now, while valid is false, which is what it starts off as, we're going to ask them, we're going to get this variable from asking the user a question, and the question is the one we were passed in the argument. Then we're going to test that variable that they've provided. If the data type of that variable is an integer, then we're going to flip that boolean over and say it's true. So this would get them out of the loop. And then we end if. But we want to check one more thing. We want to check if this number that they gave us, if it is greater than 100, then we're going to print a message so they know what's going on. And we're going to flip it back to false so we're stuck in the loop. And then that ends that if and the end while. Now, if they pass the first one and didn't pass, as in that second one didn't get fired off, then they'd get excused from the loop and we would simply return the value of user. But let's see what it's like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this thing called number that I want to get, and instead of doing an input, I'm actually just going to call check. And I'm going to pass in whatever the user... Oh, actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to pass in the question. So the question here is, what is your number? Okay, so let's go. Beautiful. All right, so step one is this one here. Beautiful. Too easy. What is your number? Actually, what I might do... Oh, no. You know what? That'll do fine. The input. Well, let's say that I'm inputting in 10. Okay, number at this point actually doesn't equal anything. So that's empty. Valid at this point actually doesn't equal anything. And user doesn't equal anything. Fine. So we go up to the start there, and that's our next line of code. That gets fired off. Well, question. Now, I actually didn't have question in here, so let's add a cell for that to the right. And their question is, what is your number? There we go. So I'll just pop that in there. So that variable didn't exist until it got passed in there. Fantastic. Now that's actually probably going to be true for a while there, but I'll deal with that in a tick. Next line, begin. Well, begin happens and input continues to equal, no, actually nothing, because we didn't collect another input. Question is still, what is your number? No other variables have been set yet. There we go. And in actual fact, that's going to be true for a while there, so I'm just going to populate that in advance. Okay, so valid now equals false. Fine. Well, that's good, because now I can say that valid equals false, so I put that in my table. Great. While valid equals false. Yep. So I put that in, and what's my value? Well, it's still false. Now, user. So basically, I'm going through and I'm doing the thinking, but I'm recording it on paper. So, here we go. The input, actually, you know what, we never did input 10. That was a mistake on my part. Here, user input. Okay, so I've got something from the user. I still don't know what number is. Valid is still false, and user is now 10, because that's what I inputted. Okay, let's go to the next line. Now, if you're confused, this is perfectly fine. This should take you a while. You're actually doing some proper thinking here. So, if the type of user equals int, well, again, there's no input here. I'm still false. The user is still 10. And that is still my question. All right. Now, valid is true. Well, as it turns out, because it passed that test, valid is now true. Fantastic. Next line, end if. Well, that doesn't really change anything in terms of that. So I'm just going to copy all of those and paste them in. Yep, all of those things are still true. So on this next line, if user is greater than 100. Well, that doesn't change any of my values either. Valid is still true, user is still 0, question is still, what is your number? Print, too large. Actually, you know what I should have here? I should have a column here for output. Now, I actually don't think this program does any outputting, but it would be good if I had a column in here for output, just so that we could record any messages that it did print. Because if we were to run this and it failed over here, then we would have some output. Okay, too easy. So, print, too large. Yeah, well, that's what the line does, but because we didn't set off that conditional, then it doesn't actually print anything. Valid equals false. Well, it says that, but because I actually, again, didn't trigger that, then valid actually doesn't change those. They're still the same. There we go. End if. Again, no changes there. And again, I'm going to paste that in. Oops, that's wrong. You know what, I might as well just write that in. 10. What is your number? Okay, end while. There we go. And in actual fact, I am going to just do a couple of... So, here, it is exactly the same. But here, when I return user, what I'm actually saying now is that number, so I'm returning it back to this function, so number now equals whatever user equaled. So let me just see if I can paste that in. I can. So this is where we're assigning a value to number. And then we have end if. And then we have end function. So, while this might seem terribly laborious, this is the way that we can make sure that our logic is working. So, we would go through and we would test that for success. So that testing table there, or that trace table there, is going through and testing it if we enter the number 10. But we'd also want to run it through and do all of the thinking and so forth if they typed in TEN. So where would it fail? What would the numbers be? What would it pass back and so forth? And it might be twice as long again because they're stuck in the loop. We would want to run it where they put in 200 and see them getting stuck in the loop. So we don't just want to chart success, we actually want to chart all of our possible outcomes so that we can see what the variables actually do as we behave, because the more complicated your program gets, then you have these questions that you have to ask, and more importantly, this is the sort of thing that comes up on the exam. So that's a trace table, and that's how you use it, and that's a validation, which you might find useful.